Hello, everybody, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Politics Matters podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Jakubowski, and today we'll be talking about the 2022 Senate elections, governor elections, and what the polls really mean. Because right now, I don't think anyone has really come to any sort of consensus about what the polls mean, and I just thought it would be important to talk with them, especially we're at this point we're 7 weeks away from the election, or a little more than that, but close to it, and you will get like wildly different takes about the polls from some people. Like the people who like the Mastriano truthers and the actually Washington is competitive, and uh Dr. Oz and Blake Masters are still going to win. Like those people are all gonna say this because like they're all kind of like saying the same thing. They're all gonna say, "Oh well, the polls are gonna overestimate Democrats by a lot again because it happened in 2020. In 2020, actually, the polling will be worse this time than 2020 because I want it to." And then the more like objective forecasters in the middle will be like, "Yeah, there'll be a polling miss. It'll probably be similar to 2020." And then some people who are more Democratic leaning or who have more Democratic leaning predictions will tell you that either there won't be a polling miss, that the polls will underestimate Democrats, or something else. I'm kind of in the middle of the Democratic camp and the more middle camp. I think that it really varies by the state. I think there will be actually some Senate races where the polls are going to underestimate Democratic support. We'll talk about those in a second. Um, I think the polls are still going to miss pretty big in the Midwest. I think obviously JD Vance is going to do a lot better than he's doing in the polls. I think Fetterman won't win by anything close to what he's up by in the polls. And Wisconsin too. I don't know what Barnes or like. I don't know what the polls look like on election day, but as of right now, I think Johnson would still outrun his polls by 3 or 4 points. So yeah. Now let's just talk about some Senate races here. I've filled out a map here. Obviously, I know this is just an audio recording, but I'll be talking about the historic polling misses in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. And I think like we'll go state by state here. We'll also talk about some governor's races like Michigan, Arizona. Um, we might throw in some others if we're get to that point. But I'll definitely talk Michigan and Arizona gov because those are some governor's races that have a lot of polls. Um, but yeah, so we'll start with I think the two obvious candidates for like very bad polling miss, which are Ohio and Wisconsin. So let's start with Ohio. At the time of this recording, JD Vance is currently trailing Tim Ryan in Ohio by 0.5%. That's like pretty good for a Republican in Ohio, in all honesty. Like, yeah, like I guess I shouldn't say good. Like, it's not good that this race is still kind of competitive at this late in the game because like this race should have been off the board 2 months ago. But yeah, like JD Vance is probably gonna be fine. He's only down by point. He's within the margin of error in a state where the polls underestimated Donald Trump by 7.3%. I have the polling misses in a spreadsheet here. I'm looking at them right now. In 2020, the polls had Biden losing Ohio by 0.8%, and he ended up losing it by 8.1%. So that is again a 7.3% you know error between Trump's polling margin, what he actually got, and like the polls in Ohio generally just suck during the midterms. Again, in 2018, they underestimated Sherrod or Mike DeWine by I think what 7%. Cordray was up to I think 2.5% in the polls on election day, and he ended up losing by around 4. And in 2018, in the final, like the Senate race was like a game over by like August, but for what it's worth, the final Emerson poll did kind of nail the race. They had it Brown up by 6. He won by 6.4. So, Emerson, which again, right now is showing JD Vance beating Tim Ryan in Ohio by 3%. They nailed the 2018 race. They were not great in 2020, but again, their crosstabs were pretty bad in 2020. And by the way, I still think Emerson's going to be pretty bad in 2022, but, uh, they were good in Ohio in 2018, and they have advanced up by 3, which I think is pretty reasonable as of right now. I still think it'll be by a lot more, but whatever. So yeah, the Ohio polls are always garbage. Like Ohio, I think like I don't know this for a fact because I haven't done the math, but like if you were to average the polling miss from 2016, 2018, and 2020, well, I think Ohio would have the biggest like swing state one. Like there's probably like a random polling miss in like Rhode Island or South Dakota or something. That's totally random, but yeah. So that's I think that like Ohio, unless Ryan takes like a 4.45 point lead on election day, I won't move it to like anything close to toss up. Again, I like Tim Ryan a lot as a candidate. I really respect what he's doing here. I respect him being the bait and running in a very hard state to win and taking away those GOP funds. But I really do not. I just don't see him really coming within 5% at this point, right? Like, let's say he leads by like right now it's within the margin of error. Like, if it's within the margin of error on election day, Vance will win by like 6, I think, which is my current prediction. And so, yeah, especially when you remember there was a 7 point polling miss in 2020, and in 2018 it was like I think 5-6%. It's not really good because like with other states where there was a polling miss in 2020, you could be like, okay, well, sure, but in 2018 the polls were actually pretty good, right? And like you can make that case for other states we'll get into in a second, but like in Ohio, the polls are just always garbage, and I don't think that's going to change. The polls are going to show a close race up until election day, and they're going to be very wrong because again, polls they just cannot for whatever reason poll working class white voters that have been breaking for Republicans. The reason the Ohio polls were like good in 2012 and good in 2008 was because they actually were able to like they showed big Democratic leads or strong Democratic numbers with the white working class, and that's obviously Obama did very well with those voters. And once those voters moved away and started voting for Donald Trump, Mike DeWine, and this year probably JD Vance, the polls haven't picked up on that, and it's where they're going to miss because like these polls will show Tim Ryan like within 5% with white voters in a state that like Joe Biden lost white voters by like I think 17% or something like that. Like it was in like I think the mid to high teens, but yeah, it's just like the exact type of seat and like the exact type of area where the white vote is going to be like horribly wrong. Is going to be like in Ohio 9 and in the Mahoning Valley, and that's why. By the way, that's why I'm pretty bearish on Marcy Copter, and that's why I'm not. I don't really have like. That's why I'm not one of the people who thinks that there's going to be like this big reversion towards Tim Ryan in the Mahoning Valley. Um. So yeah. Now let's talk about Wisconsin because Wisconsin's next off the board for bad polling misses. And in 2020, Wisconsin actually had a bigger polling miss than Ohio. It was a 7.8% error compared to Ohio 7.3% error. But the thing with Wisconsin is that Biden, like the polls in Wisconsin in 2020 were like really bad because there were like some really bad polls that were chucked into the average by 538. And if you take a look at what happened, like if you average like the same polls, Biden would probably be up by like I don't know 5%, maybe 4%, which still isn't great. It's still pretty bad error, but like it wouldn't be as egregious as it was or as it ended up being because again on election day like we had like garbage like Survey Monkey showing Biden up by 12. You had the morning consult like last week of October Biden plus 13 poll, and then obviously we had the infamous Biden plus 17 poll from I think it was ABC WAPO like 2 weeks before the election. And again you take those polls out of the average and Biden would have led in the polls and they would have overestimated him because again most polls had Biden winning by like mid-single digits, but it wouldn't have been as bad because he wouldn't have had these awful double digit horrific polls. And again the polls that are showing like are like a good Senate race margin, right? Like Civics has Johnson up by 1, which I think is pretty reasonable. They had Biden up by 4 the 2 days before the election. Atlas Intel, which is again an A-rated pollster by 538. They haven't done the Senate race yet, but they had Biden up by 2. Susquehanna had Biden up by 3, and I don't think they've done a Wisconsin Senate poll yet, but they've done some Pennsylvania polls that seem to kind of check out. And overall, it's just very like I don't think anyone really thought Biden was going to win Wisconsin by 8.5, but that's just what the poll said. So I would argue that like no one actually took those because like some people like took like the whole Ohio as a toss-up thing seriously. I, in fairness, did have Trump only winning Ohio by like 4, so I missed on Ohio too. But like Wisconsin, I think everyone knew was going to be like a lot closer than 8%, and it was just those bad polls. And then like another caveat to this is that in the 2018 midterms, in the Senate race, Tammy Baldwin was up by 0.2% less than the 538 average than she ended up winning by. So actually, in the 2018 Senate race, the Republicans underperformed their polls, and in the governor's race, RCP won't give you an average, but like the final polls are pretty all over the place. NBC had Evers up by 10, but the better polls like Marquette had a tie and they had Walker up by 1. Emerson had Evers up by 5, and Suffolk had Evers up by 2. So, the better polls either like showed like an average of like a very narrow Evers victory. Again, the polls would have overestimated, like if there's an average, probably be Evers plus 3 or something. So yeah, that would have been a minor polling miss, but it would have been pretty close to the margin of error when you consider that Evers won by like what 1%. So yeah, that's kind of where I stand on Wisconsin. If you made me guess what the polling error would be, I think an election held today would result in like a 1.5 win for Ron Jones, which would be a 3-point polling error from what we are seeing right now. Because again, Barnes is up by a 1.5 in the 538 average right now, so that's a 3-point polling error if I'm right. Again, I could see Barnes winning today. I think he'd have like a 45% chance somewhere in that range of winning. But the caveat to that is that we only know like how well Wisconsin will go for Democrats if they get a combination of like good Milwaukee turnout, plus like either the Biden number, like not Biden numbers, but like either good numbers in Waukesha or, you know, better numbers than Biden in the Driftless region, which I'm not counting on for obvious reasons because I haven't really taken the Mandela Barnes pill just yet. I want to, believe me. I like Ron Johnson's like one of my least favorite senators, and I say that like fully seriously. I think he's disgusting, and like I would be like I will throw a party if he loses in November. So I'd love to see that, but I don't think he will. So my overall point here is that I think the polls are going to miss the same way in Wisconsin as they did in 2020, not by 7 points, but probably by close to 3 or 4. And yeah, like you can point out that, oh, well, in 2018, the polls in Wisconsin were all right, but like, to me, it's kind of to me, it's kind of just a smell test thing where it's like, okay, do I really think that Barnes is up by 7 like Marquette had last month? Do I think that he's up by 4 like Fox had him up by back in August? And also, when you look at the recent polls, Marquette's new poll had Barnes down by 1, and yes, it was a terrible poll. I'm not denying that, but I'm just I'm just here to report what's going on. And then finally, we had like an NRC or an NRSC poll that had Ron John up by 4, which actually isn't that bad for Mandela Barnes because like it's a Republican internal. They want to show Ron John up, but it's also not good because it's still Wisconsin. And remember, like Ron John's the guy who won his 2016 Senate race despite not leading in the polls. So it's like very it's one of those things where it's hard to bet against him. So I think for now I'm gonna say Ron John wins by a 1.5, which is again a 3-point polling error. So I guess like if you're keeping track of my polling error predictions, I would say Wisconsin will be, a D plus 3 polling error. Ohio will probably be, if Vance is still behind by half a point, I think it'll be like a 6.5% polling error in favor of the Democrats. And yeah, so again, those polling errors, like Ohio's would be pretty similar to 2020. Wisconsin would probably be closer to like a 2018 style polling miss if they did the average for the Evers Walker race, which they don't have on RCP for some reason. But yeah, so let's go over to Pennsylvania, where like Pennsylvania is the Senate race I just hate to talk about because like there's so much like derangement on both sides. Like I think Fetterman would pretty clearly be the favorite for an election held today, and I still think he'd probably be favored heading into November. I don't quite think it's game over yet, but the fact that like I was a pretty big Fetterman doomer even 3 months ago, and I'm now just like, yeah, Oz probably won't win is pretty, like it's like the people who knew me during my Fetterman doomerism and know the podcast I did with Evan Scrimshaw like back in June, and we were like just completely dismissing his chances, being like, how is he going to win, Bucks County? How's he going to do well in Chester? How's he going to turn back the clock, right? And, slandering the Fetterman hype, right? And like now, obviously, we were wrong, thank God, because go Fetterman. But more importantly, the polls have just showed like no poll when you wait it and when you look at it for more than 2 minutes will like tell you this race is close. Like not a single poll. Trafalgar came out with a poll on Friday that had, it had like I think it had Fetterman up by 2, which yeah is pretty good for Fetterman because this is again Trafalgar had Trump winning Pennsylvania by I think a point and change. So these guys are not good at polling Pennsylvania, especially when you remember that like literally they have Peter Welch only winning by 7, they have Patty Murray only winning by 3, and they have Kathy Hochul only up by 8. Like, and I'm literally just like sighing internally as I say this because like I don't know why we're like caring what Trafalgar says because like Trafalgar forfeited the ability to be taken seriously the second that they put out their Vermont and Washington and New York polls, and so no, not Hochul plus 8, Hochul plus 4. Sorry, I just realized I said Hochul plus 8. No, they had Hochul only up by 4. It was a 47-43 race. Like, oh my God, Trafalgar. So, yeah, I don't really want to take Trafalgar too seriously, but like even if you do take them seriously, this is a Republican poll, the poll that had Trump winning Pennsylvania. That that's now showing Fetterman up by 2. And yeah, you can say, oh well, it's he was up by 5 back 6 weeks ago, and now he's only up by 2. Like yeah, okay, was it not always like painfully obvious? Like I think one of my friends on Twitter, I don't remember who said it, but I think I had a mutual on Twitter who was like, yeah, Trafalgar's totally just putting out Democratic leads because like this is right after they dropped the Mandela Barnes +2 poll. Yeah, Trafalgar's totally putting out leads for the Democrats right now so that they can come back in a month and say the Republicans are gaining momentum heading into the election. And um like the second I saw that tweet, I was like, yeah, that's basically what they're doing because like Trafalgar would never release a good like Trafalgar doesn't want to be right, which is like if they wanted to be right in 2020, they wouldn't have shown New Hampshire and Nevada as going to Trump, and they wouldn't have like unironically been like, well, actually, Trump's going to win 25% of the black vote, right? Like they exist solely to fill the void of like the super Republican pollster that the terminally online Republicans look to when everything else is going badly, and so like yeah, they'll fill that void, but they're not actually going to be right. And we know this for a fact because they were wrong in 2020. They were wrong in Georgia. They were decent in Virginia, or I think they did. They do a Virginia poll. I think they did, and I think they had Youngkin up by like 3 or 4, and he won by 2. So they were decent in Virginia, and they were very, very all over the place in 2018. But my my main point here is that like acting as if Trafalgar's like a serious pollster, the level of like an Emerson or a Susquehanna or like even like Susquehanna as a Republican pollster, I still take them somewhat seriously. Even like Insider Advantage or Signal, like these are Republican polls that I still will read and like still respect their opinion because like at least they're actually in the business of polling, whereas Trafalgar's not in the business of polling. They're in the business of like putting out random numbers that are designed to seem like polling, right? And so Trafalgar, like they will very much give you polls, but like my point here is that I do not really get how they're getting these numbers, which is why I'm not going to take them seriously. So that's my Trafalgar rant. And yeah, like the fact that we're like if you come up to me 3 months ago and been like Ryan, the conservatives on Twitter are going to be spinning a Trafalgar Fetterman +2 poll as the best poll for Dr. Ross of the cycle, I would have looked at you and been like, okay, then Fetterman's going to win, right? Because like if Trafalgar is showing a Republican down in a state where they had Trump winning in 2020, the Republican's probably down. And like you can like look at the crosstabs and you can like pull out the chalkboard and you can give me a 20-minute explanation, use algebra to substitute crosstabs and say, well, actually, if X happens, then Y can happen. Then there's a 3/4 chance of B happening. Throw in, the chance of Z happening, and you're going to get V, right? Like you can make a very convoluted explanation for actually the Trafalgar poll is good for John Fetterman. You cannot make a serious point or a point that I will be interested in having a discussion with you about that would suggest that Fetterman being up to in a Republican poll is somehow bad for him, because it's not. And like the constant spin on things gets really annoying when like every time a poll good for Democrats comes out, there's just total silence. And every time something that like could be spun as good for Republicans comes out, it's like, oh wow, well actually, this is happening. So the whole like Fetterman is actually losing thing because he's lost 3% in Trafalgar is just total nonsense. And I'm actually like when I saw that poll, I was like, okay, well Trafalgar's going to have Oz up by like a point in November to just show the momentum. And I really don't care what they say because like I lost any ability to take those guys seriously after the Vermont poll. So yeah, again, and if you look like the 2020 poll I missed in Pennsylvania, it was a 3.5 point swing towards Trump. So yeah, I have no problem with applying that to Pennsylvania because I don't think Fetterman's lead will shrink to like anything less than a 5-point lead by election day, if that. Right now, Fetterman leads the polling average by 9.5%, which again isn't all that surprising. He's had a consistent lead. He's been up by like at least 7, like since the beginning of the summer. No, sorry, I shouldn't say that. Since like the beginning of July. Or no, sorry, I'm wrong. He's been up by 7 since the end of July, or basically since after we had like a full 4 weeks of like Dobbs to set in, Fetterman really skyrocketed because like he was only up by 4 back in June, and now he's been up by 7%, 8%, 12%, 10%, 11%, 9%. He's been in the high single digits, low teens. But like when you look at all these polls, YouGov has Fetterman up by 5. which again I think is a fairly reasonable guess for where we are as of today. I think it'll be a little less by election day because Oz will still mobilize because like there's still like some amount of Republicans who wouldn't vote today but would vote in November, or like not wouldn't vote but like maybe wouldn't have an interest in voting, wouldn't know about the election, wouldn't be as sour on Fetterman as they will be after the attack ads continue to roll in, whatnot, all those factors. It's worth like maybe a point or so statewide. So yeah, Fetterman +5 right now isn't a terrible guess. Echelon has Fetterman up by 21, which is ridiculous, but it's still really funny. And again, like someone posted a meme on Twitter and it was like, well, if the Republicans are chucking in their garbage polls for our polling average, so can we. And I'm like, yeah, I don't like, there's no interest in checking any of the Echelon or like the Center Street PAC polls because like they're all terrible and like they all have like Tim Ryan and Val Demings winning, and not Val Demings, like they have Tim Ryan winning. They think Kelly, Fetterman, and we're not going by like 10, 15, 20 points each. Like it's all completely nonsensical, but it's really funny because like it gets run the polling average and it like boosts the Democrats by like 3%, which is like objectively hilarious. That's funny. Center Street PAC, which I mentioned just a second ago, had Fetterman up by 19. Susquehanna, which I think is a pretty good Pennsylvania poll. They did have Trump winning it in 2020, but they were really close. They're only like I think 2% off, and again, like they're Republican leaning, but like I'll still read them. I still think they're interesting. They had Fetterman up by 5. Emerson had Fetterman up by 5. Franklin and Marshall had him up by 13. And then Public Opinion Strategies, which would partnered with a Republican poll, had Fetterman up by 18, although again that was back in August. So yeah, the latest polls have been Trafalgar Fetterman +2, Yuga Fetterman +5, and then ignoring all the garbage Center Street PAC Echelon polls, Susquehanna had him up by 5. So again, the recent +2, +5, +5 polls would all average out to again about a 4-point lead for John Fetterman, which I think is like again a pretty good guess for where we are. I think win by 4 or 5 if the election were held today. But yeah, so again, if you take a 3.5-point polling average and throw it into the to the 5-point lead that he'd have today, that's probably what I think happens on election day. I think he wins by maybe 1.5, 2% on election day. But yeah, the important thing to remember in Pennsylvania is that the polls there will always consistently overestimate Republicans, will consistently overestimate Democrats. Like they overestimated Biden by 3.5. They overestimated Casey by 1.5. So like, yeah, they're always going to be a little bad, but like there's like a very low, or like there's like a very high ceiling. Sorry, there's like a very high floor on where they are. So like they won't be like bad enough to give Oz a victory, because for Oz to win, they need to be like a bigger than, or like a 20 main Senate level polling miss, and in Pennsylvania, you have like a lot less polling volatility. So I could see the polls missing by 4%, but not 10%, 12%, whatever he needs right now. And so that's why again, I think by election day the polls are going to show like a 6, 7-point, maybe 8-point lead for John Fetterman. I think he wins by 2. Again, I'm kind of banking on the polls just being bad because no one believes the Fetterman +20 polls that keep coming out every few weeks, and like I think like they're going to inflate the polling average, but like ultimately, like the Republicans are gonna just like Oz will have like a fundamental disadvantage in the polls because he'll be down, because like there will be 2 polling averages in Pennsylvania on election day. There will be like a polling average of like the really bad, like of all the polls, which will have like Fetterman up by 8 or something like that, maybe 7. And there'll be a polling average of like the sane polls, which will have Fetterman up by 4, and he'll probably win by 2. So I think in the sane polls, there'll be like a maybe 1-2 point polling miss. And then then like all the polls in total, there'll be a bigger polling miss. But that's, because in 2020, we didn't have Center Street PAC and Echelon having Biden up by like 25 in Pennsylvania. So that's the difference. That's what I'm getting at. I know I gave like a kind of a tangent about it, but that's what I'm getting at. So again, I think there will be a bigger than 2020 polling miss in Pennsylvania, maybe 5%, 4 or 5%, but that's not like that's not actually representative of what's actually going to happen, if that makes sense. I want to go to North Carolina now because I think I just want to briefly get that out of the way. There's not too much to say there. Again, as of today, Sherry Beasley is currently leading by 0.4% over Ted Budd. It's again very narrow. The reason that she has such a big lead right now, or has not such a big lead, but she has a lead, is because she's up in PPP. She's up in this Capital Communications poll, which was a Republican poll for some reason that has her up, and she's tied in Signal. And if the 530 average will adjust for that, and they'll give her a lead. Trafalgar had her down by 3, which is pretty good for Trafalgar standards, because again, they pulled like a pretty good electorate, but it's Trafalgar, so they're always doing something wonky there, and they're like generally Trafalgar overestimates Republicans by 3-4%. So If you apply that, she'd be even, maybe leading. And then the best poll by far of North Carolina has been from ECU, East Carolina University, that has Ted Budd up by 3. Again, they're really good with North Carolina polls. I think that if the election were held today, he'd probably win by 2-3%. But yeah, so I don't know what the polls will look like on election day. I could see anything ranging from like a Beasley lead to like any narrow lead. I think it'll be within 2% either way. But the polls in North Carolina are like missed like the same way every time. We don't have a 2018 statewide race to judge a polling miss off of, but in 2020 they underestimated Trump by 3.1%. In 2018 or in 2016 they underestimated him by 2.8%. So again, they're going to see a similar thing. I think Bud will be like, let's just say he's even on election day. I think he'll win by 3. I'm just going to go with the same polling miss again because I think it's under discussed how the polls missed by the exact same amount in 2016 and 2020, which again actually isn't terrible for the polls / Democrats when you remember that the average poll. It's almost funny because it's kind of like comparing a national environment trend. Like the average poll from 2016 to 2020 probably was like 2% worse towards the Democrats. North Carolina basically stayed the same because I would make a joke about North Carolina being stagnant in every way possible. And it just truly goes to show how dedicated they are to being stagnant, that even their polls didn't move from 2016 to 2020. So I think we'll see a similar thing. I think Bud's going to win by 2.5-3% on election day. I think he'll be even, maybe, up by half a point in the polls. So yeah, call another 3-point polling error in North Carolina. So Georgia. Yeah, Georgia's one of the states where I could totally see there being a pro GOP polling miss. I wouldn't like predict it outright just yet, but like, I don't know. So right now, and I don't. Again, it's hard to predict how the polls will move between now and election day because I don't know how much Walker's going to screw up. I would assume by a little bit, but I don't think it'll be by like a ton. Right now Warnock's up by 2.7%. I think he'd win like a runoff by like maybe 2. Like, I don't really have any opinion on like there being a big polling miss in Georgia the way I do in Ohio or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania for that matter. But again, I've talked, but when you take out the crazy polls, it won't actually be that big of a polling miss. You know the drill. I've said it like 12 times in this podcast. Broken record. The thing with Georgia is that I could totally see, like, let's just say it goes to a runoff here. Like, I'm assuming that no one will get a majority of the vote on election day. Like, let's just say it goes to a runoff. I think Warnock would have like a 75% chance of winning a runoff. And I would say he wins. Like, I could see winning by anything between like a very narrow win and like 3.5-4%. Like, that's the range of outcomes. Yes, Herschel Walker could still win, but like we're just assuming Warnock wins because it's I think the most likely outcome. And I think the median outcome there would be like a 2 and change win, like 2.2, 2.3, kind of random like that. Similar to 2021 win, just because Georgia would have gotten bluer from January 2021, and you'd have like some level of Dobbs backlash. And yep, that gets Warnock to like a slightly bigger than 2021 type victory, which is still very good for him. I also think Walker is like a weaker candidate for a runoff than Loeffler. He might be like about as good in a general, but runoffs are a lot more suburban-y, and Loeffler was not great in the suburbs, but she also wasn't atrocious, and Walker is atrocious, and so yeah, I think Warnock being up by 2.7, I could totally see that. So, like, I don't know where the polls will be on election day. I still think Warnock will have a lead. Again, when you look at all the good polls, Quinnipiac has Warnock up by 6. I think we had the Insider Advantage, which is a Republican pollster, has had Walker up by 3, but also down 3. So it really varies. But like we haven't gotten like enough Georgia polls, I don't think, because again, like you can talk about like the double-digit Warnock polls from Center Street and Echelon, but again, I've talked about how much I hate those polls. Trafalgar obviously is just Trafalgar, and then Emerson, which is usually like okay, it is worth looking at, had Walker up by 2, but had him doing 50% better with Black voters than Loeffler, and so like yeah, Walker might do like 5, 6, 7% better than Loeffler with Black voters, but like it won't be by 50%, obviously. So yeah, I guess I'll just say there will be like no polling miss, but like if Walker takes lead in the polls on election day, if it's like within a point, I'll probably still have him winning. Again, in fairness, and when I say him, I mean I'll probably still have Warnock winning. In fairness, I guess I will mention the past polling misses. In 2020, RCP actually had Trump up in Georgia by a point, and obviously he lost Georgia. 538 had Biden up by 1.2. He won it by 0.2, so 538 was pretty good. They only had a D+1 polling miss. And then in 2018, we had no Senate race there, but in the governor's race, which again was hotly contested on both sides, we had Kemp up in the 538 polling average or in the RCP polling average by 3, and he ended up winning by 1.4. So yeah, that's kind of like where I think we're at. I just think there will be like a very neutral type polling error. It'll maybe be like 0.3% on either side, but I don't really have any strong feelings. Arizona. So Arizona is kind of like Georgia in that in 2020 the polls were all right. They had Biden doing about 2% better than he actually ended up doing, so it was within the margin of error, but it still wasn't right like perfect. But in 2018 and in 2016, for what it's worth, 2016 I think Clinton beat her polls by 3% in Arizona. In 2018, the RCP average had McSally down, or had McSally up by 1. She ended up losing by 2.4%. So again, that's a nearly 3.5% polling error, which, by the way, is the same as the 2020 Pennsylvania polling error. So if we're playing the whole 2020 Pennsylvania polling error game, then I raise to you 2018 or Arizona polling error, which obviously didn't hold up in 2020, because again, the whole argument of just we'll just take the polling error from 2020 and apply it to 2022 is not really good, because again 2020 was a really bad year for the polls, as was 2016 when you looked at it from 2018 perspective. And so if in 2016 you were telling someone in Arizona, oh well, the polls basically everywhere basically overestimated Democratic support, and Hillary was supposed to win the polls, she didn't win the election, and the fact that McSally's still ahead in the polls, she'll win by 4, that did not work out well. So again, it's a state by state thing is what I'm saying here. And so the people who are like someone tried to unironically say that Blake Masters will win because if you look at because he wanted to apply the 2020 Wisconsin polling error to Arizona, and I was like, dude, you have to take a 5-hour, 4.5-hour flight from Madison to Phoenix to do that. Oh my god. So yeah, I think Arizona there will be a polling error, and I don't say that because I think the Arizona polls are broken or anything. It's just because the polling average right now is just way too good to be true. Kelly literally is up by the same amount as Michael Bennett right now, and Bennett's going to win by 8, and Kelly's going to win by probably I'll say 3. So and again, that is a conservative estimate. I know most people think Kelly's going to win by 5 or 6, but I'm a bit more of a not doomer, because I wouldn't say doomer, but I guess I'll just say that I think Kelly's gonna run a little worse with Hispanics than some people are expecting, but whatever, it's not really a big deal. It won't really cost him anything statewide, hopefully, and again, it's only a 2% difference. So right now he's up by 8.6% in the polls. He's had a pretty big lead for a while. At this point, 2 weeks ago on the 2nd of September. It's essentially the 4th of September. So on the 4th of September, he was up by 7.8. He's now up by 8.6. He was up by 10 back in August. That's only because we had a slew of really bad polls. But yeah, he's in a pretty good spot. He's at 49.4%. He's pretty close to the halfway mark. And his margins are inflated because we have Center Street having up by 21. We have Insider Advantage having up by 6, and we have Echelon having him up by 15. Actually, I probably shouldn't label Insider Advantage as a bad poll because they are a Republican poll. They just haven't been consistent in the past. But, take out the Center Street PAC polls, take out the Echelon polls, and just for fun, take out the Beacon Research polls from last month that had Kelly up by 11 and 14% respectively. And you're going to get a D+4, D+5 type polling average. And I think that's that's what the polling average should be. And when you apply 2020 polling miss in Arizona, you had the D+3 result I was talking about. But obviously the bad polls are going to keep polling Arizona, and we're going to keep getting inflated results, which is really, really annoying because we won't actually have a good literally what I'm going to do the week before the election is I'm just going to have the actual polling average, and I'll have my Ryan polling average. It'll just be me chucking out all of the bad polls and being well, this poll's garbage. I don't care. I'll do an average of the actually good polls, and I'll show you the actual result, and it'll probably be closer to what the actual results are going to be, because there's no way Mark Kelly's going to win by 20% as much as I would like that to happen. But yeah, so the 538 hours will probably have Kelly up by 7 or 8 on election day. The RCP polls had Kelly up by 6% on election day 2020, and he won by 2.4. And RCP is a bit more Republican leaning, so I don't remember what the 538 average was, and it won't let me show it, but it was probably Kelly's probably up by 7% on election day 2020 and 538 if I remember correctly or had to guess. And he's up by 8.5 now, so I think again he'd probably win by a point more than 2020 at this rate. Things could change. I haven't written Blake Masters off yet, unlike some Republicans who don't think he can win anymore. But yeah, I think Kelly wins by a little over 3% when it's all said and done. And again, that will be, like I've said, a polling error similar to what we would see if you took out the garbage echelon and the garbage for center street pack polls. So yeah, that's Arizona. Call it a because Kelly will be up by 7 on election day in the polling average. Call it like a D+4 polling error. But again, similar to Pennsylvania, it won't actually be that representative of what people will be thinking. And finally, Nevada. Nevada is like the one state where I think the polls are going to overestimate Republicans because again, Trafalgar's going to pull. Like I just know Trafalgar's going to pull Nevada like the week before the election, show Laxalt up by 3.5%, and then be like, "Well, look at the GOP gaining momentum, right?" And also, Trafalgar actually does have a poll, and they have a Laxalt up by 2 right now. So, yeah, and also, we had we had the obviously that McLaughlin poll that only had Laxalt up by 1, which was literally in April, which is crazy to me because like in April, Laxalt probably would have actually beat Cortez Masto. And in like even if like McLaughlin is one of the poorer GOP polls, and if even they couldn't find a big Laxalt lead, that's not good for them, for Laxalt's camp, I should say. So yeah, the 538 average has Cortez Masto by 3. I think she wins by like a point and a half if the election were to be held today. And I still think I think she wins by like that much in November because Nevada's a pretty like it's not a boring Senate race in that like it's decided. It's just that Laxalt and Cortez Masto are pretty like generic politicians who won't like do crazy stuff like Oz and Walker, and it doesn't have like the volatility of a Blake Masters. So I think my D+1 expectation probably won't change between now and November, and so I'm like I've had it as tilt D since like May or no sorry since June, and so like that's like enough for me. And so the polls might dip a little bit because I think we're gonna get like a slew of like super Republican leaning polls coming into Nevada, but you know, I don't think anything will change. The polls will probably have Cortez Masto up by a point. She'll probably win by like 1.3 and something like that. So yeah, that's Nevada. Call it like a D+0.2 polling error. That's just a random number. It could be D+1, could be D+2, could also be maybe a slightly Republican leaning polling error. But yeah, so that's Nevada. I guess I'll say that. I will say, for the purpose of being intellectually honest here, the 2020 polls in Nevada actually weren't that good. They had Biden winning by 3% more than he actually won by. That's mostly because you had a big problem with polling Las Vegas due to the COVID lockdowns, and um, you know, big problem there. And also, in fairness to the Nevada polls in 2018, they had RCP had I think Heller up by 0.1% at election day, and he lost by 5. So I'll just leave that out there. And also, like, I don't know what the exact governor's margin was, but I think Laxalt was supposed to do a lot better than he actually ended up doing in 2018. Because again, Nevada polls historically been really bad for Democrats, and they've ended up doing a lot better, right? Like Sharon Angle was supposed to win her Senate race. Trump was up in the polls in Nevada on election day 2016. Cortez Masto was down in her 2016 polls. Sisolak and Rosen were, I think, losing by like very narrow margins. They ended up winning by 4 and 5% respectively. So I don't, it's kind of banging on like a minor reversion, but like 2020 was much more the exception than the rule in the Nevada polls. And also, by the way, the 2020 polls had Biden up by what, like 5.5% in Nevada. Like I was always someone who thought that Nevada was going to be like a 3-point margin, and I was always convinced it was be very close. So I'm gonna try to like I'll hope that my Nevada instincts are going to be you know serve me well again. So I guess to recap for the Senate part of the podcast, and yes, I'm almost done here. I'll probably just talk about Michigan and um Arizona Gov. We've already done Arizona, so we'll just talk about Whitmer, and then we'll uh we'll head out here. But Pennsylvania, I think there will be about a 4-point polling error towards the Democrats. So again, Oz will do 4% better than he'll be up in the polls by on election day. I think Johnson will beat his polls by 3. I think Vance will beat his polls by around 6.5, maybe 7 even. I think Bud will beat his polls by 3. I think the Georgia polls will be pretty close to accurate, if maybe a slight Democratic or a slight Republican bias. I think Masters will beat his polls by 4, although again, like I said, he will not actually be up by 8. He'll just be, or he won't actually be down by 8. He'll just be down by 8 when you factor in all the other polls. I think Nevada will probably be like a very slight Republican bias. So yeah, now let's talk about Michigan here because we do actually have a polling average there now, and it's a governor's race that I think there's like a lot of takes about, and I don't really see why. Because like if there wasn't like so much like hatred with Gretchen Whitmer like from like the right, like most people would be like, yeah, okay, um, it's probably a likely D race. I have it as likely D. I could easily see it being lean D, I'm mostly just like because I think that Whitmer's gonna win by like 5.5, 6%. I could easily see it falling below 5, but I just don't think like I'm pretty confident she'll win at this point, especially when you remember that she's literally at 50% of the vote and the polling average, and Dixon hasn't even cracked 40 and like the average yet. And even Trafalgar, which again had Trump winning Michigan by 2, has Whitmer up by 4. And remember, they had I think John James carrying Debbie Dingell's seat. They had Trump winning Michigan. They always underestimate Democrats in Michigan by a lot, and they have Whitmer up by 4, which is and like they probably tried to find a closest Dixon. Like they tried to probably find Dixon as close as they could, and the best they could do was the D+4 poll. So good job, Trafalgar. Um, Glenn Griff had Whitmer up by 13. Epic MRA, which I don't know what that is, but I think it's just some random poll. Michigan had Whitmer up by 11. Blueprint had Whitmer up by 12. Fabrizio has Whitmer up by 5, which is pretty good for Fabrizio's Donald Trump's pollster. Detroit News / WDIV TV had Whitmer up by, they did a bunch of polls that Whitmer up by 15, 14, 12, 10, and 8. And then we had a bunch of polls back in May that had Whitmer winning by like 30, but those polls are completely ridiculous. So yeah, that all averages out to an 11-point Whitmer lead. I don't think she'll win by 11 because that would be her beating her 2018 numbers, and 2018 is probably like her reasonable peak. I know she's a better candidate now than she was then, and I know that Tudor Dixon's not a very good opponent by any stretch of the word, but um, this is still a very this is still a much more polarized. Like 2018 was like polarized, obviously, compared to like past years. Like it wasn't as polarized as 2020 or 2022. And it was also a year where the Republicans pulled out of Michigan. Like, yeah, they're kind of doing that this year too. But like, it was just such a lot. Like, it was a D+8 environment. The Republicans didn't really have anything to contest in Michigan, and this year will probably be, Michigan. Like polarization will boost Republicans' floor a little bit, and it'll just kind of clean up their margins, some of the more redder areas. Because like Whitmer did like insanely well in like the Upper Peninsula and like rural Michigan. She'll run behind her 2018 numbers by a lot in those rural areas. She'll probably do better she'll do better in the suburbs. She'll probably do pretty well in the city. She'll probably hold up fairly well in the working class areas like Macomb and whatnot. But I just don't think that she has like enough she just doesn't have the upside anymore to win by 9.5% like she did in 2018. I think she'll win by like 5-6%, but I think 9.5 is like her realistic cap. Yeah, so I think the polls are going to narrow up a little bit before election day. Trafalgar will come out with a poll showing it like even in like late October. They'll be like, it's a toss up, guys. Tudor Dixon's getting momentum, but again, these people had Trump winning Michigan, so I won't really take that too seriously. And also, we'll probably have some level of narrowing in polls just because some undecideds because like right now Dixon's at 35, 39, 39, 37, 38, or no, sorry, I read that wrong. 35, 39, 39, 40% in the poll she's trailing in, which is like she'll get like probably I think she'll lose like 46.5 to 52 or something like that. So she'll get at least mid 40s in terms of vote share, if not high 40s. So yeah. I'll just assume Whitmer is going to lead by like 8 on election day, and I think that there will be like a 2-point polling error towards Dixon because again, the polls still did underestimate Trump by 5% in Michigan. They still had Stadner doing 2% better than she ended up doing in 2018 against John James. So Michigan's a state that tends to have a bit of a polling bias towards Democrats. So yeah. So again, call it 3-point polling error in favor of Whitmer, but she'll still probably win by like 5% or 6% or something like that. Likely D. I don't really have any interest in like continuing the whole Whitmer's by the way, I was a big Whitmer doomer back in last year, back when it looked like James Gregg was gonna be the GOP nominee, because I thought that he'd do kind of well in Detroit for a Republican, and that he was gonna do a lot better in the suburbs, and he was gonna be able to get out the rural GOP base because he's a cop, and that would get a narrow GOP victory. And now I'm just kind of dude, Dixon's an awful candidate. It's a post-op year. Whitmer has really good approval. She'll probably win by a comfortable amount, probably more than Biden. So yeah. Again, this wasn't like a coherent, cohesive podcast. I was just gonna I wasn't trying to make a point this podcast. I was just trying to lay out what I think the polls will be like. I kind of wanted to tease my whole idea of making a polling average, my Ryan polling average, on election week, and I'll post it on Twitter and whatnot. But yeah, so thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a like. If you're on YouTube, if you're on YouTube, subscribe, all that stuff. If you're on Spotify, you can review the podcast. Apple Podcast, same thing. And again, you're always free to DM me on Twitter, tell me your thoughts, tag me on Twitter, whatever you want. I'm at Ryan Jakubowski. Go follow me there if you don't already. Go read my writing at uepyt.substack.com. Again, uepyt.substack.com. Go check out my YouTube channel, Unbiased Election Predictions, all that stuff. It's all linked in my Twitter bio. So again, go follow me there at Ryan Jakubowski. So thank you so much, and I will see you all in the next episode next week. Have a good week.